What if everything you believed about your family was a lie? In Manhattan's glittering towers, the Bennett family harbors a devastating secret. A mother declared dead fights to survive in captivity. Her daughter lives homeless on the streets while billions flow through the family empire. A young boy's mysterious dreams might hold the key to exposing 15 years of deception. This is a story about unbreakable family bonds, the dangerous lengths some will go to maintain power, and the courage to fight impossible odds. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, please subscribe to support more compelling stories like this one. Let's begin. The morning air tasted like exhaust and broken promises as Thomas Bennett pressed his small hand against the bulletproof glass of his father's car. At 8 years old, he had already learned that the world outside their armored vehicle was dangerous. His grandfather Richard had made sure of that. But today, something was different. Today, the danger felt like hope. "Dad," Thomas whispered, his breath fogging the window. His heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird fighting for freedom. "Dad, look." Alexander Bennett barely glanced up from his phone, fingers dancing across the screen as he managed 3 corporate crises before breakfast. The Hong Kong merger was bleeding money. The board was breathing down his neck, and his father's latest suggestions felt more like commands with each passing day. "Not now, Thomas. We're already late for..." "Dad!" The urgency in his son's voice cut through the corporate noise like a knife through silk. "That girl. She's my sister." The phone slipped from Alexander's fingers, clattering against the leather seat like his world tilting off its axis. He followed his son's trembling finger toward the sidewalk, where a girl sat huddled against the cold brick of a building. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her dark hair matted, but her face. God, her face. It was like looking at Catherine through a time machine, every feature a perfect echo of his wife who had been dead for 7 years. The same delicate chin, the same thoughtful eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was listening to something only she could hear. The girl's eyes met his through the tinted window, and something electric passed between them. Recognition. Fear. A connection that defied logic and reason. "Stop the car," Alexander commanded, his voice raw with emotion. "Jenkins, stop the car now." But by the time the driver managed to pull over, fighting through the morning traffic that moved like thick honey, the girl had vanished. Gone as completely as if she had been nothing more than a ghost, a figment of their imagination. Alexander stood on the sidewalk, his expensive Italian shoes scuffing against the concrete as he searched desperately through the sea of pedestrians. The city moved around him like a river around a stone, indifferent to his sudden desperation. "She was there," Thomas said, joining him on the sidewalk. His young voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "She looked just like the picture of Mom in your office." "Please, Dad. We can't leave her out here." Alexander knelt before his son, studying the boy's face. Thomas had always been different, more perceptive, more sensitive than other children. He noticed things that others missed, felt things that others overlooked. And now this impossible declaration about a sister. "Thomas," Alexander began carefully, "your mother and I only had you. You don't have a sister." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his mind like water through cracks in a foundation. Catherine's final days had been shrouded in mystery. Her sudden illness, the rushed hospital transfer, the closed casket funeral that his father had insisted upon, it all felt wrong now, viewed through the lens of this moment. "She's my sister," Thomas insisted, his young voice carrying a conviction that made Alexander's chest tight. "I dream about her sometimes. Mom is there too, and she's singing to us both." Alexander's world tilted on its axis. The carefully constructed reality he'd lived in for the past 7 years began to crack like ice under pressure. Those dreams Thomas had mentioned, he dismissed them as a child's way of processing grief, of wanting the mother he'd lost too young. But what if they were something more? Jenkins, he called to his driver, his mind already racing ahead to possibilities he'd never dared consider. Take Thomas to school, then cancel all my appointments for the next week. But sir, the board meeting. Cancel everything, Alexander cut him off. Something more important has come up. As he watched Jenkins usher a reluctant Thomas back into the car, Alexander pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Marcus? It's Bennett. I need you to look into something for me. It's about Catherine's death, and I need everything. Hospital records, death certificates, staff interviews. Everything. Above him, the towering Bennett Enterprises building cast its shadow across Fifth Avenue, the empire his father had built and that he had inherited. For the first time in his life, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the truth he could feel slipping through his fingers like sand. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory stirred. Catherine's last words to him before she was taken away. Protect them both, Alex. Promise me. He hadn't understood then. But now, standing on that busy Manhattan street, Alexander Bennett finally began to comprehend the weight of a promise he'd failed to keep. Marcus Kelly's office existed in the gray space between official and underground, where truth lived in filing cabinets that smelled of coffee and desperation. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across cluttered desks, and the walls were covered with photographs connected by red string, the visual language of conspiracy and revelation. This doesn't add up, Alex, Marcus said, spreading documents across his desk like a dealer laying out cards. His fingers, stained with ink and years of handling evidence, traced the inconsistencies with practiced precision. The death certificate says Catherine died at St. Matthew's Hospital, but I've got city records showing that facility was closed for renovations 3 months before her supposed death. Alexander's hands clenched into fists as he stared at the fraudulent death certificate. The paper felt flimsy in his hands, like the lies it represented. Keep going. The doctor who signed it, Dr. James Morrison, he doesn't exist. At least not in any medical registry I can access. Marcus pulled out another file, thicker than the first. The timeline is wrong too. You told me Catherine was admitted for severe depression and anxiety. The hospital transfer papers show she was moved to a specialized facility, but there's no record of which one. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as the weight of deception settled around them like fog. Alexander could hear his own heartbeat in the silence between Marcus's revelations. But here's where it gets interesting, Marcus continued, producing a manila folder that looked like it had been through a war. I found records of a Jane Doe admitted to Evergreen Psychiatric Center on the same day Catherine was supposedly transferred. The admission was ordered by someone with enough influence to bypass standard protocols. Evergreen Psychiatric. Alexander's blood turned to ice water in his veins. The facility was known for its discretion, its exclusive clientele, and its connections to his father. Show me everything you have on that admission. Marcus handed him a grainy security camera photo, the image blurred by rain and time. It showed a woman being helped from a car, her face partially obscured by shadows, but her profile achingly familiar. This was taken at Evergreen's rear entrance, Marcus explained. The timestamp matches Catherine's transfer date. Alexander studied the photo until his eyes burned, memorizing every pixel. She was pregnant, he whispered, noting the subtle swell of her abdomen that the loose hospital gown couldn't quite hide. What did you say? Catherine was pregnant when she disappeared. Alexander's voice cracked like thin ice under pressure. We hadn't told anyone yet. She wanted to wait until after the first trimester. Marcus leaned forward, his expression darkening like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Alex, Evergreen isn't just a psychiatric facility. It's got a fully equipped medical ward, including... He paused, the words hanging in the air like a sword about to fall. Including a maternity unit. Off the books. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. If Catherine had been alive when she arrived at Evergreen, if she had been pregnant. The girl on the street, he breathed. Thomas's vision. It wasn't a coincidence. There's more. Marcus's voice was quiet now, the kind of quiet that preceded earthquakes. I found a series of payments from a Bennett family shell corporation to various children's homes and foster care facilities across the state. The payments started around 9 months after Catherine's admission to Evergreen. Alexander stood abruptly, pacing the small office like a caged animal. His father. All this time, Richard Bennett hadn't just taken Catherine from them. He had taken. I've got people looking into staff records from that period, Marcus continued. Many of them have mysteriously relocated or taken early retirement with generous pensions. But one nurse agreed to talk to me. She's scared, but she remembers a patient matching Catherine's description. Says the woman was kept heavily sedated, but would sometimes sing lullabies in her lucid moments. What kind of lullabies? Something about a ray of sunshine. Alexander froze. Sunshine, he repeated softly. Catherine used to call Thomas her little ray of sunshine. She'd sing to him every night, the same gentle melody that had filled their apartment with warmth and love. The nurse mentioned something else, Marcus interrupted gently. The baby. It was a girl, born healthy, taken away immediately. The only thing the mother managed to give her was a hair ribbon with something embroidered on it. Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from Thomas's school. His son had drawn another picture in art class. The teacher was concerned because it showed the same scene over and over. 2 children, a woman with long dark hair, and the words, "My ray of sunshine," floating above them like a prayer. Marcus, Alexander's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. I need everything you can find on Evergreen Psychiatric. Staff records, patient logs, security footage. Everything. And I need you to trace those payments to the children's homes. Find out where they sent her. As he turned to leave, Marcus called after him. Alex, your father, he's still on the board at Evergreen. If we start digging, then he'll know I'm coming, Alexander finished. Good. It's time he learned that some things are more important than the Bennett name. Outside Marcus's office, the Manhattan sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, his daughter was surviving on the streets. Somewhere, Catherine might still be alive, trapped in a chemical prison of Richard's making. And somewhere in between it all was his father, the puppet master who had orchestrated this elaborate devastation. But Alexander Bennett was no longer the dutiful son who followed orders without question. He was a father who had just discovered his family was bigger than he'd ever known, and he would tear down heaven and earth to make them whole again. Luna had learned that shadows were safer than light, that silence was better than screams, and that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. 8 years on the streets of Manhattan had taught her these lessons written in hunger and cold, in narrow escapes and sleepless nights. But lately, something felt different. She was being watched. It had started with the man in the expensive car, the one whose eyes had locked with hers through tinted glass like he was seeing a ghost. Something about him had felt familiar, like a half-remembered dream that lingered at the edges of waking. And the boy in the back seat, with his wide, serious eyes, she'd seen his face before, in fragments of memory that visited her in the quiet hours before dawn. You need to eat something, dear, Maria said, pressing a warm container into Luna's hands. The owner of the small Venezuelan restaurant was one of the few people Luna trusted, one of the few who asked no questions about her past or her future. You're looking too thin. Luna managed to smile, breathing in the smell of rice and beans that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. Thanks, Maria. I'll try to pay you back someday. Nonsense. Maria waved her hand like she was shooing away flies. Just promise me you'll consider talking to that social worker who came by yesterday. Carmen's good people. She really wants to help. Luna's grip tightened on the container. Social workers meant questions, and questions meant forms, and forms meant a system that had already failed her once. She had a card from this Carmen Rodriguez. It was tucked safely in her jacket pocket, next to the only thing she'd managed to keep through all the years of running. The ribbon. It was faded now, the embroidery barely legible, but Luna could still make out most of the words. My ray of. The last word had been lost to time and weather, but in her dreams, she knew it was sunshine. That night, in her current sleeping spot, a forgotten maintenance room in an abandoned subway station, Luna pulled out the ribbon and traced the familiar embroidery with fingers that remembered the feel even when her mind couldn't recall the source. She'd discovered this place months ago, picking the lock with skills learned from necessity and desperation. Inside, she'd created a semblance of home, a relatively clean mattress, a battery-powered lamp, some books rescued from recycling bins. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel made her freeze. No one else knew about this place. She'd been so careful, so quiet. Her hands moved automatically to her backpack, stuffing in her most precious possessions. The ribbon, the books, the small photograph she'd found of a woman who looked like her older sister might have looked. Hello. A woman's voice, gentle but carrying the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with people who had every reason not to trust. Luna? My name is Carmen. I followed you to make sure you were safe. I'm not coming closer. I just want to talk. Luna's heart raced like a sparrow trapped in a cage. How had this woman found her? How did she know her name? The street kids called her Luna because she'd been found on a full moon night, but this woman spoke like she knew more than that. How did you find me? Luna called out, staying in the shadows of her small sanctuary. I'm good at my job, Carmen replied simply. And I know what it's like to hide. I was like you once, a long time ago. Something in her voice made Luna pause. It wasn't the practiced sympathy of someone who'd read about homelessness in a textbook. It was the real understanding of someone who'd felt the same fear, the same desperate need to disappear. What do you want? To show you something. A photograph. Then I'll leave, and you can decide what to do next. Luna crept closer to the tunnel entrance, staying in the shadows, but close enough to see. Carmen slowly withdrew a photo from her jacket and held it up to the dim light filtering through the station. It was a hospital photo, dated 15 years ago. A woman in a hospital bed, heavily sedated but beautiful, with Luna's eyes and Luna's face. And in her arms, barely visible before being taken away, was a newborn baby with a familiar ribbon in her tiny hand. Luna's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall to sit on the cold concrete. The dreams, the memories, the man in the car, it all started to align like stars forming a constellation in a night sky that had been dark for too long. Her name is Catherine Bennett, Carmen continued softly. And she's been asking for her ray of sunshine every day for 15 years. The ribbon felt warm in Luna's pocket, like it was pulsing with its own heartbeat. In her mind, the woman's voice sang clearer than ever. My ray of sunshine, my ray of sunshine. There's a man looking for you, Carmen continued. And a little boy who somehow knew you were his sister. But more importantly, there's a woman who never forgot you, never stopped fighting to remember you. The question is, are you ready to remember her too? Luna's fingers found the ribbon, tracing the familiar embroidery. For the first time in years, she felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. If I come with you, Luna whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant rumble of trains, will you tell me everything? Carmen's smile was gentle but determined. No, I'll do something better. I'll help you find the truth yourself. But Luna, we need to move fast. There are people who don't want this family reunion to happen. For 8 years, Luna had survived by trusting no one and running from everything. But now, clutching the ribbon that connected her to a mother she'd never known and a family she'd never imagined, she made a choice that would change everything. She stepped out of the shadows and into the light. In a sterile room 3 stories above the manicured gardens of Riverside Wellness Center, Catherine Bennett sat by the window, watching clouds drift across the sky like thoughts she wasn't allowed to have. The new medication was lighter. They'd had to reduce the dosage during the transfer, and for the first time in years, her mind felt clearer. Clarity was dangerous. She'd learned that lesson written in needle marks and sedation schedules. But clarity was also the only weapon she had left. The facility was different from Evergreen, newer, with more security but fewer patients. Something had changed. Something had frightened them enough to move her 3 times in the past week. Each transfer had been calculated precisely, each new room mapped carefully in her memory. "Morning medication, Mrs. Bennett," announced a young nurse, entering with a breakfast tray. "New staff," Catherine noted. They were all new here, which meant either everyone had been replaced or this was an entirely different kind of operation. Catherine's fingers brushed against the small piece of paper she'd managed to hide in the seam of her chair, a newspaper clipping smuggled to her by one of the older nurses at Evergreen before the transfer. The headline was barely visible, but she'd memorized every word. Bennett Enterprises CEO launches internal investigation. Alex was looking for her. After all these years, he'd finally started to uncover the truth. She took the paper cup of pills, maintaining the docile expression she'd perfected over 15 years of captivity. The nurse watched her swallow them, checked her mouth for hidden medication, then left with a sympathetic smile. What the nurse didn't know was that Catherine had learned to create a small pocket under her tongue, a technique perfected through years of desperate determination. Once alone, she moved to the bathroom, disposing of the medication she'd pretended to swallow. Her mind needed to stay sharp now. Alex was coming, and she had to be ready. But it wasn't just Alex she thought about during her long hours of enforced silence. It was Thomas, her beautiful boy who'd been barely a toddler when they took her away, and the baby, her daughter, torn from her arms moments after birth. She'd only glimpsed her once, but that moment was seared into her memory, tiny fingers clutching the embroidered ribbon Catherine had managed to hide in her hospital gown. "My ray of sunshine," she whispered to the empty room, the lullaby she'd sung through years of sedation echoing in her mind like a prayer. The sound of voices in the hallway made her return quickly to her chair. Through lowered lashes, she watched as Richard Bennett, her father-in-law, her jailer, strode past her door, speaking in harsh whispers to the facility's director. "The journalist is becoming a problem," Richard's voice carried through the thin walls like poison through water. "And Alexander's getting too close. We need to move her again." "With all due respect, Mr. Bennett, frequent transfers increase the risk of exposure. The staff at Evergreen are already talking." "Then silence them. I didn't spend 15 years protecting the family name to have it destroyed now." Catherine's fingers dug into the arms of her chair, but her face remained impassive. Richard had always been obsessed with the Bennett legacy. Her pregnancy had been the final straw, another heir he couldn't control, one who might inherit her instability. But Richard had miscalculated. He'd assumed the medications would eventually break her, that years of isolation would erase her memories. Instead, they'd only sharpened her resolve. Every day, she'd forced herself to remember Alex's laugh, Thomas's first steps, the weight of her newborn daughter in her arms. She'd counted days by meals, mapped the facility by counting footsteps, memorized staff rotations and security patterns. And she'd listened. Through the haze of sedation, she'd gathered fragments of information like pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. The night nurse who mentioned a homeless girl with familiar eyes. The janitor who spoke of Alexander Bennett asking questions at shelters. The security guard who complained about a persistent journalist. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. A different nurse entered, older, with kind eyes that held a hint of purpose Catherine recognized. "Time for your walk in the garden, Mrs. Bennett." Catherine stood slowly, her movements careful and measured. But as they walked through the corridors, the nurse spoke in whispers that only Catherine could hear. "My name is Carmen Rodriguez. I'm a social worker. I found your daughter." Catherine's step faltered, but years of practice kept her expression neutral. The nurse, Carmen, steadied her with a gentle hand. "She has your eyes," Carmen continued softly. "And she still has the ribbon." Tears threatened to fall, but Catherine forced them back. Showing emotion now could ruin everything. Instead, she squeezed Carmen's hand once, a signal she understood. "Your husband and a journalist from the Times are building a case," Carmen murmured as they reached the garden. "But Richard Bennett knows. He's planning to move you again, somewhere even Alexander won't find you." Catherine's mind raced. After 15 years of waiting, everything was happening at once. Her daughter was alive, Alex was searching, and now, finally, she had an ally on the inside. As they turned back toward the building, Catherine made her decision. She'd spent 15 years playing the docile patient, waiting for a chance. She wouldn't wait any longer. "When?" she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. Carmen's response was equally quiet. 3 days. "Be ready." For the first time in 15 years, Catherine Bennett felt the corners of her mouth turn up in a real smile. Richard had wanted to break her, to erase her. Instead, he'd created his own worst nightmare, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The game was about to change, and Catherine was ready to play. The newsroom hummed with the electric energy of a story about to break wide open. Sarah Chin stood before her investigation board. Red string connecting photographs, documents, and timeline markers like a spider's web of truth waiting to be unraveled. Coffee had become a food group over the past week, and sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she was this close to exposing something that could change everything. The transport company was a dead end, she announced to Alexander Bennett, who sat in her makeshift command center surrounded by evidence of his father's crimes. Shell Corporation, like everything else connected to Richard Bennett. Thomas sat nearby, drawing in his sketchbook while the adults worked. His latest creation showed the same scene he'd been depicting for days, a white building with blue windows, surrounded by flowers, nestled against mountain peaks. "She's in a white building with blue windows," Thomas said without looking up from his drawing. "There are lots of flowers outside, and mountains in the background." Both adults turned to stare at the boy. Sarah spoke first. "Thomas, how do you know that?" "I see it when I sleep." He held up his sketchbook, the drawing eerily detailed for something created by an 8-year-old. "Mom is there?" "She's awake now more than before. And she's waiting." Alexander crossed the room to examine his son's drawing, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. After years of dismissing Thomas's dreams as imagination, he'd learned to listen to his son's impossible insights. "Sarah, any facilities matching this description in your files?" The journalist was already typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Give me a minute." Her screen filled with search results, architectural photos, and location data. "Got it. The Riverside Wellness Center, opened 6 months ago in the Adirondacks. Owned by a subsidiary of..." She paused, her expression shifting. "Interesting. Not your father's company. This one traces back to the Whitman family." "Julian Whitman." Alexander's voice sharpened like a blade finding its edge. "My father's oldest friend and Evergreen Psychiatric's primary stockholder." Sarah pulled up more documents, the connections becoming clearer with each revelation. "The network's been there all along. We just weren't looking for it." Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Kelly. "Got the nurse's logbook. Records of every patient transfer from Evergreen, including where they went. Meeting in 20. Before he could respond, Sarah's computer chimed with an incoming email. Her expression changed as she read it, hope and urgency warring in her features. "Alexander, it's from Carmen Rodriguez. She's made contact with Catherine. The room seemed to freeze, even Thomas stopping his drawing, his young face intense with concentration. She's lucid, Sarah continued reading. They've reduced her medication during the transfers and Alexander. She remembers everything. Every day, every person, every detail of what they did to her. Alexander gripped the edge of Sarah's desk, his knuckles white with tension. The girl, our daughter? Carmen found her. She's safe, but we have to move fast. Your father's already suspicious of Carmen's credentials. If he digs too deep, he'll find out she's working with us. Alexander straightened, decision crystallizing in his mind like water becoming ice. How soon can you have the story ready? Sarah gestured to her investigation board. Months of work displayed in organized chaos. The basic framework is done. I just need to verify the Whitman connection and... She paused as another email arrived, this one from Nancy at Evergreen. Security footage from the night Catherine gave birth, and copies of the real medical records. The door to the newsroom opened, and Luna stepped inside, Carmen Rodriguez beside her. The girl's resemblance to Catherine was even more striking in the harsh fluorescent light. She clutched her worn backpack with one hand, the faded ribbon visible between her fingers like a promise made tangible. I remember the song, Luna said softly, her eyes fixed on Thomas's drawing. She used to sing it every night, even when they tried to make her stop. Thomas walked over to his sister, taking her hand as if they'd never been apart. I know. I heard it too. Alexander watched his children, the son who'd never stopped believing and the daughter he'd failed to protect, and felt something shift inside him. The corporate warrior, the dutiful son, the cautious businessman, those versions of himself fell away like old clothes. What remained was simply a father, ready to tear down heaven and earth to make his family whole again. Sarah, he turned to the journalist, his voice carrying the steel of absolute determination. How quickly can you get a camera crew to the Riverside Center? Within the hour. I have a contact at Channel 7 who's been following the story. Carmen nodded. Catherine will be ready. But Richard Bennett has a private helicopter on standby. If he suspects anything. He already does, Marcus Kelly announced, striding into the newsroom waving a file like a battle flag. Just intercepted this. Transfer orders signed this morning. They're moving her tonight. Alexander looked at the assembled group, the determined journalist, the undercover social worker, the private investigator, and his two remarkable children. Years of power plays and corporate negotiations had taught him to recognize defining moments. This was one. Then we move now, he declared. Sarah, call your camera crew. Marcus, get me everything you have on Riverside's security protocols. Carmen, can you get back in? My shift starts in 3 hours. Good. Alexander knelt before his children, studying their faces, Thomas with his thoughtful eyes and Luna with her survivor's strength. Are you ready to help us bring your mother home? Their matching expressions of fierce determination were all the answer he needed. The Bennett family was about to be reunited, and Richard Bennett was about to learn that some things were more powerful than money, influence, or carefully guarded reputations. The truth was finally coming to light, and it would burn away everything built on lies. Richard Bennett stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching storm clouds gather over Manhattan like an omen written in wind and rain. The empire he'd built over 5 decades sprawled before him, towers of glass and steel bearing the Bennett name, each one a testament to his vision of legacy and control. But now that legacy was threatening to crumble like sandcastles before an incoming tide. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from Julian Whitman, Channel 7 News van spotted heading toward Riverside. Alexander's making his move. Richard's jaw clenched until his teeth ached. He'd underestimated his son's determination, had dismissed Thomas's strange perceptions as childhood fantasy. But most of all, he'd underestimated Catherine's resilience. 15 years of chemical restraints hadn't broken her spirit. They'd only made her more dangerous. Mr. Bennett. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom like breaking glass. The board members are assembled in the conference room. Tell them I'll be there shortly, he replied, straightening his tie and checking his reflection in the window. The face that looked back at him was that of a man who'd sacrificed everything for control, who'd made the hard choices others couldn't make. The conference room fell silent as he entered, like a theater holding its breath before the final act. These were men and women who'd helped build his empire, who'd looked the other way when necessary, who'd understood that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them like fire spreading through dry wood. We face a crisis. My son, influenced by emotional manipulation and false memories, is about to make public accusations that could destroy everything we've built. The Catherine situation. Julian Whitman spoke from his seat at the table, his voice carrying the weight of shared secrets. I thought that was handled. It was, until Alexander started listening to his son's imaginings. Richard's lip curled slightly, dismissing the possibility that Thomas might actually see truth others couldn't. Now he's allied himself with a journalist from the Times. They have documentation, some real, some fabricated, suggesting impropriety in our medical facilities. A board member leaned forward, concern etched in the lines around her eyes. What exactly do they have? Records of patient transfers, financial transactions, security footage. Richard waved his hand dismissively, like shooing away flies. Nothing that can't be explained. But in today's climate, mere accusations can be devastating. We need to act decisively. He pressed a button, and the room's screens lit up with prepared statements and legal documents, each one crafted to deflect and redirect. Each of you has a role to play. When the story breaks, we'll present a united front. Catherine Bennett was a troubled woman who received the best care money could buy. Any suggestion otherwise is a sad manipulation by those seeking to profit from family tragedy. And Alexander? Another board member asked, the question hanging in the air like smoke. He's still CEO. Not for long. Richard distributed another set of documents, papers that would sign away his son's freedom as surely as if they were made of chains. These papers, signed by our medical experts, declare him emotionally compromised and temporarily unfit for leadership. The board will need to vote on interim management. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room like wind through wheat. These were powerful people, used to making hard decisions, but this was different. This was family. I understand your hesitation, Richard continued smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in power. But consider the alternatives. If Alexander's accusations go unchallenged, every decision this company has made will be scrutinized. Every medical facility we've partnered with, every private treatment center, every discreet arrangement for troubled relatives of influential families, all of it exposed. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in like stones through water. Many of them had their own secrets, their own carefully managed family situations, their own reasons to keep certain truths buried. The helicopter is standing by at Riverside, Julian added. Catherine will be moved to a secure location within the hour. Once she's stabilized, we can address Alexander's concerns through proper channels. Richard nodded, satisfied with the room's shifting mood. But before he could continue, his phone buzzed again. The message made his blood run cold. Catherine's gone. Rodriguez was working with them. News crew already on site. For the first time in decades, Richard Bennett felt control slipping through his fingers like water through a broken dam. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying a new urgency, I'm afraid we need to move faster than anticipated. Julian, initiate Protocol Winter immediately. The rest of you, prepare your statements. When this story breaks, we need to be ready. As the board members filed out, their faces pale with the understanding of what they'd just agreed to, Richard remained at the head of the table. He stared at the empire he'd built, the legacy he'd crafted from ambition and ruthless determination. He'd sacrificed his own humanity piece by piece to create this monument to power. He'd locked away his daughter-in-law, separated his granddaughter from her family, and was about to destroy his own son. But empires weren't built on kindness. They were built on control, on the willingness to do whatever was necessary to maintain power. The storm clouds outside had reached the Bennett building, thunder rumbling through the steel framework like the sound of worlds ending. Richard Bennett smiled grimly, picking up his phone to make one final call. Some storms could be weathered. Some truths could be buried. And some rebellions needed to be crushed before they could take root. The war for the Bennett legacy was about to begin, and Richard intended to win, no matter the cost. The Riverside Wellness Center's pristine corridors echoed with the sound of Carmen Rodriguez's footsteps as she made her evening rounds. Her uniform was perfect, her documentation flawless, her authority unquestioned. No one suspected that beneath the professional exterior beat the heart of a revolutionary. Catherine Bennett was ready. 15 years of captivity had taught her patience, had honed every sense until she could read danger in the air like others read the weather. She heard Carmen's approach and understood that this moment would determine everything. "Evening medication, Mrs. Bennett," Carmen announced loudly for the benefit of security cameras that watched like electronic vultures. But her hands were already moving with practiced efficiency, producing a set of clothes from beneath the medication tray. "They've initiated Protocol Winter," she whispered as she helped Catherine change from patient gown to nurse's uniform. "Richard Bennett's final failsafe. We have maybe 20 minutes before the facility goes into complete lockdown." Catherine's fingers, stiff from years of forced inactivity, fumbled with the buttons of the uniform. "Thomas and Luna?" "Safe with Alexander and Sarah. They're waiting with the news crew at the north entrance." Carmen's voice remained professional and calm even as she helped Catherine with her disguise, years of undercover work allowing her to maintain the performance even under pressure. "Can you walk?" "I've been practicing," Catherine replied, her voice stronger now, her movements more certain. Every day of reduced medication had brought back more of her strength, more of her determination. They moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency. Carmen had spent weeks memorizing the security patterns, the staff rotations, the blind spots in the camera coverage. But Protocol Winter would change everything. New security measures, additional guards, complete communication blackout. They reached the staff elevator just as the first alarm sounded, subtle but unmistakable to those who knew what to listen for. The regular staff continued their routines, unaware of the silent crisis unfolding around them like smoke spreading through a building. "Mrs. Whitman is asking for her evening tea," Carmen announced loudly as they passed the nurse's station. The staff barely glanced up, accustomed to the routines of their wealthy, demanding patients. But Catherine's heart nearly stopped when she saw the figure striding through the main entrance. Julian Whitman himself, his face twisted with barely controlled rage as he spoke urgently into his phone. "Richard, they're already here. Channel 7's van is at the north gate, and Alexander's lawyer just served us with papers. We need to." He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they passed. "Wait. Something's wrong," Catherine realized. Julian's gaze followed them, his corporate instincts recognizing a pattern that didn't fit. Carmen's grip on Catherine's arm tightened slightly, but they maintained their steady pace toward the service exit. Behind them, Julian's voice rose like a siren cutting through the night. "Stop them. That's not a real nurse." The next moments exploded into chaos. Security alarms blared in earnest now. Heavy doors began sliding shut throughout the facility like the jaws of a trap closing. But Carmen and Catherine were already running, years of planning and preparation driving them forward through corridors that suddenly felt like a maze designed to contain them. They burst through the service entrance into the rain-soaked evening. Lightning illuminated the scene like a photographer's flash. News vans with satellite dishes, police cars with flashing lights, and Alexander Bennett standing with two children beside a black SUV. Mom. Luna's voice cut through the storm, through 15 years of separation, through every barrier Richard Bennett had tried to build between them. Catherine's legs nearly gave out at the sight of her daughter, no longer the newborn torn from her arms, but a beautiful young woman with her eyes and her spirit. And Thomas, so grown, so brave, holding his sister's hand like he'd never let go. But there was no time for reunions. Security teams were emerging from the building like ants from a disturbed nest, and Julian Whitman's voice was growing closer, shouting orders into his phone. "Get in," Sarah Chen called from the news van. "We're live in 3 minutes." Alexander reached them first, supporting Catherine as her strength wavered after years of chemical suppression. She looked up into his face, lined now with years of worry and determination, and saw the same love that had sustained her through 15 years of darkness. "I never stopped looking," he whispered. "I never stopped fighting," she replied. They reached the van just as the helicopter appeared over the mountain ridge. Richard Bennett's final attempt to maintain control, to reclaim what he saw as his property. But it was too late. Sarah Chen's camera was already rolling, capturing every moment of the escape, every proof of the conspiracy that had held a family prisoner for 15 years. As they pulled away from Riverside, Catherine held her children close, feeling their warmth, their reality, the proof that love could survive anything. The storm raged outside, but inside the van, a different kind of storm was breaking, one of truth, of justice, of a family finally reunited. "It's over," Alexander said softly, watching the facility disappear in the rain. But Catherine, who had learned to read every nuance of danger during her captivity, knew better. "No," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "This is just the beginning. Richard Bennett won't let go of his empire without a fight." She looked at her family, her brave, determined family who had never stopped believing, never stopped searching. They had won this battle, but the war for truth was far from over. The storm clouds parted briefly, revealing a sky painted in shades of gold and purple. Somewhere in that sky, a ray of sunshine broke through, a promise of hope, of healing, of battles yet to come. The news van raced through Manhattan's rain-slicked streets like a messenger carrying fire. Inside, Sarah Chen's hands were steady as she adjusted her camera settings, years of investigative journalism having prepared her for moments when truth balanced on the edge of a knife. "We're live in 60 seconds, she announced, her voice carrying over the sound of Marcus's expert driving through back roads that most people didn't know existed. "Mrs. Bennett, are you ready?" Catherine sat straight-backed beside her children, her face composed despite their harrowing escape through maintenance tunnels and service corridors. Years of institutional control had taught her to hide her emotions, but now that mask would serve a different purpose. "I've been ready for 15 years, she replied softly. Alexander watched the streets through the van's tinted windows, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from the corporate world he'd left behind. Board members were choosing sides. Stock prices were fluctuating wildly. The Bennett empire was trembling on its foundation like a house built on sand. Going live in 5, 4, 3. The red light blinked on, and Sarah's professional voice filled the van like a bell tolling the end of one era and the beginning of another. Good evening. I'm Sarah Chen with Channel 7 News, bringing you a breaking story of corporate corruption, medical abuse, and a family's fight for justice. With me tonight is Catherine Bennett, legally declared deceased 7 years ago, yet very much alive and now free from forced imprisonment in private psychiatric facilities controlled by Bennett Enterprises. Catherine faced the camera with quiet dignity, 15 years of silence ending in this moment of truth. My name is Catherine Bennett. For 15 years, I was held against my will, drugged and isolated, on the orders of my father-in-law, Richard Bennett. My crime? carrying a child he feared would threaten his control over the family legacy. Behind the camera, Carmen monitored police frequencies on her tablet. "They're setting up roadblocks on major routes to Manhattan," she reported quietly. "But they don't know about Marcus's back routes." The satellite feed showed viewer numbers climbing exponentially as Catherine continued her story. Social media exploded with reactions, shares, and demands for justice. In corporate offices across the city, employees of Bennett Enterprises watched in stunned silence as their company's darkest secrets were exposed. "The evidence is irrefutable," Sarah narrated, displaying documents on a split screen. Falsified death certificates, illegal medical procedures, suspicious financial transactions spanning decades. But perhaps most shocking is the human cost. The camera turned to Luna, sitting beside her mother like a portrait of resilience. Luna Bennett, born in captivity and separated from her family, forced to survive on the streets of New York while her grandfather presided over a multi-billion-dollar empire. Luna squeezed her mother's hand as she spoke, her voice strong despite her years of hardship. "I always knew I belonged somewhere. I had dreams, memories that didn't make sense until now. A song about sunshine, a mother's voice, a brother I'd never met but somehow knew." Thomas spoke next, his young voice carrying the weight of truth. "I saw them in my dreams too. Dad thought they were just nightmares, but they were real. They were always real." The van swerved suddenly as Marcus avoided a police checkpoint, his years of investigative work having taught him every hidden route in the city. "Alternative route engaged," he called back. "Stay focused on the broadcast." Sarah kept the camera steady as she addressed her audience, her voice carrying controlled outrage. "We're coming to you live while still evading attempts by local law enforcement, acting on questionable orders, to return Mrs. Bennett to custody. But the truth cannot be contained any longer." Alexander's phone buzzed again, a message from the board of directors. His eyes widened as he read it. "They're calling an emergency session. Shareholders are demanding my father's immediate removal." Richard Bennett's response to these allegations, Sarah continued, has been to attempt to have his own daughter-in-law forcibly committed again. But this time, the world is watching. Catherine leaned forward, her face filling the frame as she spoke directly to millions of viewers. "To every family who has lost someone to these private facilities, to every person silenced by money and power, your truth matters. Your story matters. And we will not stop until every hidden document is revealed, every secret facility is exposed, and every person responsible is held accountable." The viewer count passed 1 million as Catherine spoke directly to her father-in-law, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had survived the worst and emerged unbroken. "You tried to break me, Richard. You tried to erase me. But you forgot something important. Love leaves traces that no amount of money can erase, no amount of drugs can blur, and no amount of power can control." Suddenly, Marcus's voice cut through the broadcast. "Incoming, Richard Bennett's private security detail, 3 vehicles." But it was too late for Richard Bennett's interventions. The truth was already out, streaming live to millions of viewers, shared across every social media platform, picked up by international news outlets. The camera captured every attempt to stop them, every abuse of power, every desperate grasp at control. The Bennett empire had been built on secrets and silence. But now, in the back of a news van racing through stormy Manhattan streets, those secrets were crumbling in the face of something far more powerful, the raw, uncontainable force of truth finally set free. Richard Bennett watched his world unravel on a dozen screens in his executive office, each monitor showing a different angle of his empire's destruction. The stock price of Bennett Enterprises plummeted like a stone through water as Catherine's broadcast reached international networks. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from board members, shareholders, and journalists, but he ignored them all. "Sir," his assistant's voice trembled through the intercom like a leaf in a hurricane. The FBI is in the lobby. They have a warrant. Richard's lip curled slightly as he switched off the intercom. He'd prepared for this possibility, even if he'd never truly believed it would come. His private elevator would take him to the helipad, where his pilot waited. A few hours to his private island, then a network of offshore accounts and carefully maintained foreign identities would ensure his comfort. But as he reached for his briefcase, the elevator dinged unexpectedly. The doors opened to reveal Julian Whitman, his oldest friend and co-conspirator, looking decidedly unpredictable. "It's over, Richard," Julian said quietly, stepping into the office like a man walking into a funeral. "The board has voted. Your control of the company is suspended pending investigation." Richard's laugh was hollow, echoing off the glass walls like the sound of something breaking. "The board? I built this company. I own the board. Not anymore." Julian placed a tablet on Richard's desk, displaying a live feed of the emergency board meeting. "They're voting to cooperate fully with federal investigators. Everyone's turning, Richard. The hospital administrators, the doctors, the financial officers, they're all making deals." "Cowards," Richard spat, his carefully constructed facade cracking like ice under pressure. "After everything I've done for them." "How?" Julian's voice rose, years of suppressed guilt finally finding expression. "You imprisoned your daughter-in-law for 15 years. You separated a mother from her newborn child. You falsified medical records, bribed officials, destroyed families. For what, Richard? Control? Legacy?" Richard slammed his fist on the desk, the sound echoing through the office like a gunshot. "Everything I did was to protect the Bennett name, to ensure our position." Catherine was weak, emotional, unpredictable. Her children would have inherited her instability. Her children. Julian laughed bitterly. "Have you seen them, Richard? Really seen them? Thomas, with his extraordinary perception. Luna, who survived years on the streets with her mother's strength and resilience. They're not unstable, they're extraordinary. And you were too blind to see it." The sound of footsteps in the corridor grew louder, like thunder approaching. Richard moved toward his private exit, but Julian blocked his path. "Get out of my way." "No." Julian stood firm, his voice carrying the weight of decades of regret. "I've spent 30 years helping you destroy lives, telling myself it was necessary, that we were protecting something important. I watched you tear your own family apart, and I said nothing. Not anymore." Richard's hand moved toward his desk drawer, but Julian was faster. "Looking for this?" He held up the small key. "I removed your gun an hour ago. Did you really think I'd let you take the easy way out?" The office doors burst open as FBI agents flooded in, weapons drawn, badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Behind them came Alexander, his face set in grim determination. "Richard Bennett," the lead agent announced, his voice carrying the authority of justice finally served. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, false imprisonment, and numerous other charges we'll be detailing at length." As the agents moved to handcuff him, Richard looked at his son, seeing in Alexander's face the same determination that had once driven Richard himself, but tempered with something Richard had never possessed: love without conditions. "Everything I did was for you," Richard said, his voice cracking like old leather. "For our family name." "No," Alexander's voice was quiet but firm. "Everything you did was for control. But you forgot something, Father. The Bennett name doesn't belong to you alone. And we're going to rebuild it into something better." "Sir?" An agent interrupted, holding up his phone. "You'll want to see this." The screen showed a live news feed from the Bennett Tower lobby, where Catherine stood with Thomas and Luna, surrounded by reporters. After 15 years of silence, she was speaking, her voice strong and clear. "I'm announcing the formation of the Bennett Foundation for Family Justice," Catherine was saying. Every penny of my husband's inheritance will go to helping families torn apart by corporate greed and abuse of power. We will investigate every private facility, expose every corrupt practice, and reunite every family separated by money and influence." The lobby erupted in applause. The image showed Luna and Thomas beaming up at their mother while Sarah Chen stood nearby, tears in her eyes as she watched justice finally prevail. Richard sagged in the agent's grip as the last vestiges of his control slipped away like sand through his fingers. His empire wasn't just falling. It was being transformed into something he'd never imagined, never wanted, and could never control. As they let him out, Julian's words followed him like an echo that would haunt him forever. "You know what the irony is, Richard? If you just loved them, really loved them, without conditions or control, you could have had the greatest legacy of all, a family that changed the world for the better." The elevator doors closed on Richard Bennett's empire, not with a bang but with the quiet certainty of justice finally served. Above the city, the storm clouds began to part, letting through the first rays of morning sun, nature's own subtle reminder that after the darkest night, light always returns. 1 year later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the Bennett Foundation headquarters, casting warm light across walls covered with photographs of reunited families. Each image told a story of separation overcome, of love triumphant, of the unbreakable bonds that connect hearts across time and distance. Catherine Bennett stood before the newest addition to their wall of hope, a photograph of the Riverside Wellness Center, now permanently closed, its patients transferred to legitimate facilities where they would receive real care instead of chemical imprisonment. The Senate hearing went well, Alexander announced, entering with coffee and the morning papers. The headlines told the story of their year-long fight. Bennett Protection Act passes. Private psychiatric facilities face new oversight. Family Justice Foundation helps 200th reunion. Luna looked up from her desk, where she was reviewing case files for their youth outreach program. At 18, she had become the foundation's most effective advocate for homeless youth, her own experience giving her unique insight into helping lost children find their way home. "The Morrison family wants to thank us personally," she said, holding up a letter. "Their daughter was found in a facility in Colorado, exactly like you predicted, Thomas." Thomas smiled from his spot by the window, where he was drawing, not the dark, prophetic images of his childhood, but bright scenes of families together, children playing, hope made visible. His gift had transformed from a burden into a beacon, helping other sensitive children understand their own abilities. "Any word from the trial?" Catherine asked. Alexander nodded. Father's appeal was denied. The conviction stands. Julian's testimony helped seal the case. They had all visited Richard during his trial, not for reconciliation exactly, but for understanding. Prison had changed him, made him smaller somehow. He'd asked about everyone, especially Luna and Catherine, and had cried when Thomas told him about the Foundation's work. "Do you think he understands now?" Luna had asked after one visit. "I think," Catherine had replied carefully, "that understanding comes in many forms. Your grandfather spent his life believing that power meant control. Perhaps now he's learning that true power lies in letting go, in trusting love to find its own way." Sarah Chen arrived for their weekly planning meeting, her latest documentary about the Foundation having won 3 journalism awards. "Ready for the good news?" she announced, waving a folder. "The international expansion is approved. We can start helping families across borders now." Carmen Rodriguez, now the Foundation's Director of Field Operations, spread out a map showing their planned reach. "We've got contacts in 12 countries already. The network is growing faster than we ever imagined." As they worked, planning their next moves in the endless fight for family justice, the afternoon sun painted the office in shades of gold. Outside their windows, the city moved with its usual rhythm, but now it seemed different to Catherine. Not a maze of shadows and secrets, but a landscape of possibility and hope. "Mom," Luna said softly, looking up from a drawing Thomas had made of their family. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd never found each other?" Catherine gathered her children close, breathing in the miracle of their presence. "Sometimes. But then I remember that some connections can't be broken, not by time, not by distance, not even by people who try to keep us apart." The phone rang with news of another case, another family beginning their search for reunion. There would always be more work, more families to help, more truths to uncover. But that was okay. They had found their way home to each other, and now they could help light the way for others still searching in the dark. As evening fell over the city, the Bennett family gathered for their favorite tradition, dinner together, sharing stories and plans for the future. The formal dining room of Richard's penthouse had been replaced by this cozy space filled with photographs, children's artwork, and the comfortable chaos of a home well loved. "I had a dream last night," Thomas announced as they passed the bread. "But it wasn't like the old ones. It was just us together, helping people. And everything was bright." Luna smiled, reaching for her brother's hand. "No more hidden sunshine." Catherine looked around at her family, whole, healing, and helping others find their way to the same peace. The old Bennett empire had crumbled, but from its ruins had grown something far more valuable, a legacy of truth, justice, and unconditional love. Outside their windows, the city lights twinkled like stars. Each one perhaps marked another family's journey toward reunion and healing. The work wasn't finished, might never be finished, but that was okay. They had found their way home to each other, and now they could help others find theirs. The Bennett name would continue to transform, not through power or control, but through love, truth, and the tireless work of helping others find their way back to each other. Their story had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal, that families torn apart could find their way home, that love truly was stronger than any force that tried to contain it. In the gentle evening breeze, Catherine could almost hear the echo of her old lullaby, the one she'd sung through years of sedation, the one that had helped her children recognize each other across time and distance. "My ray of sunshine, my ray of sunshine." But now it wasn't just a song of longing. It was a promise fulfilled, a truth proven, a light that would continue to shine for generations to come. This was their real legacy, not an empire of glass and steel, but a network of healing, hope, and unconditional love that would continue to grow and transform lives long after their own story had become legend. Above them, the first star of evening appeared, bright and steady against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new truths to uncover. But tonight, in this moment, surrounded by love and purpose, they were exactly where they were meant to be. They were home. The end. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the Bennett family's fight for truth and reunion. Stories like this remind us that even in our darkest moments, love finds a way to break through the lies that try to contain it. What did you think of Catherine's incredible resilience? Could you imagine fighting for 15 years to protect your family's memory? If this story moved you, please like and subscribe for more compelling tales of human strength. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you.